I found out exactly what I was worth to my husband's family the day his mother forgot I was standing right behind her. She was on the phone in the living room, voice low, but not low enough, the way people get when they assume they're alone. I had just come home from work, still in my coat, bag on my shoulder, keys in my hand. The hallway light was off, and I hadn't turned it on yet. I remember the smell of that house, roasted onions from dinner, old wood, and something faintly floral from the candle his mother kept near the window. Ordinary smells, the kind that become permanently attached to a memory you wish you could let go of. "Claire's fine, I suppose," she was saying, in that careful tone people use when they're trying to sound neutral and failing completely. "She keeps things running, you know how it is. But Marcus, he never really moved on from Renee. You can hear it when he talks about Sophie. There's still something there." A pause, then quieter, almost fond. "Some things just don't go away." I stood in that hallway for maybe 10 full seconds, not moving, not breathing particularly well. Just standing there while the words rearranged themselves into something I couldn't unhear. Then I turned the hall light on, set my bag on the chair by the door, walked into the kitchen, and started making tea. His mother wrapped up her call 2 minutes later and came in asking how my day was, and I told her it was fine. Long, but fine. The way I always did. She nodded, opened the fridge, and that was that. I never brought it up. Not that night, not the next morning, not at any point in the 8 months that followed. But something shifted in me in that hallway, quietly and without ceremony, the way ice shifts under pressure long before anything on the surface shows a crack. Marcus came home an hour later with takeout and a good mood, and I sat across from him at the kitchen table and watched him talk about a project he was excited about, and I smiled in the right places, and I thought, how long have I been the last person in this house to know what everyone else already understands? That question followed me to bed. It was still there in the morning. If this story is already getting to you, stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. And if you want to hear how it all unfolds, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps more than you know. Marcus and I had met at a point in both our lives when we were each, in different ways, trying to rebuild something. He had come out of a difficult divorce, shared custody of a daughter he clearly adored, a career that was promising but not yet stable. I had come out of several years of pouring everything into work and not much else. We fit together in the way two people can when they each believe the other is exactly what was missing. We got married after 2 years together. Simple ceremony, close friends, no fuss. I liked that about us, or what I thought was us. We didn't perform, we just lived. The arrangement to move into his family's house was meant to be temporary. That word again, temporary. It has a way of becoming permanent the moment it stops being questioned. His parents had a large place with a finished upper floor that sat mostly unused, and with Marcus pouring every spare dollar into getting his architecture firm off the ground, it made practical sense. I had a steady, well-paying job as a senior analyst at a logistics firm. I handled our shared finances. I paid the larger share of expenses without making it a conversation, because that felt like the right thing to do when you believe in someone. What I didn't fully account for was how quickly a practical arrangement can quietly define your position in a household. Not through anything dramatic, through accumulation. The small things that pile up so gradually you don't notice the weight until you're already bent under it. I was the one who paid the internet bill, the utilities, the joint credit card. I managed the insurance, tracked the lease, kept the calendar of school pickups and appointments. I cooked most evenings and didn't mind that. I covered gaps in Marcus's business expenses twice without being asked, because I could see the stress in his shoulders, and I loved him, and that felt like what love looked like in practice. And slowly, without anyone deciding it out loud, I became the kind of person in that house that everyone relied on, and almost no one noticed. Reliable, useful, furniture. Marcus's first wife, Renee, lived across town. She and Marcus shared 9-year-old Sophie, a bright, watchful girl who reminded me sometimes of a small scientist, always studying the room. Renee was not my enemy. She was something harder to define than that. She was the original, the one the family had already shaped itself around. And no matter how many dinners I made or bills I paid, there was a version of this family that existed before me and seemed, to certain people in that house, to be the version that still counted most. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was being insecure. I told myself a lot of things in those months that I no longer believe. The first time Renee walked into a family dinner, and everyone in the room physically turned toward her like plants turning toward light, I was standing 3 feet away holding a dish I had just spent an hour preparing. Nobody turned toward me. I want to be precise about this because it matters. It was not one dramatic moment of rejection. It was a pattern so consistent and so quiet that for a long time I mistook it for my own imagination. Renee would arrive, and the room would change temperature. His mother would soften. His father would smile more. Even Sophie, who was perfectly warm with me on ordinary days, would light up in a different way, a more complete way, the way a child lights up when the specific person they need most walks through the door. I understood that part. Sophie was her daughter. That made sense. What didn't make sense was the way the adults around me seemed to file me into a separate category without ever saying it out loud. Not unwelcome, exactly, just not necessary. Like a piece of furniture that functions well enough, but that nobody would actually miss if it were gone. Renee herself was not unkind to me. That almost made it harder. She was polite, measured, careful in the way that people are when they're aware of a delicate situation and want to handle it well. We had exchanged maybe 200 words total across all the occasions we had been in the same room. Always pleasant, always slightly formal, always with that invisible wall between us that neither of us had built but both of us maintained. What I noticed, though, was how that wall disappeared the moment she and Marcus started talking. Not in a way that was inappropriate, nothing like that. It was subtler and, in some ways, more unsettling. They spoke the way people do when they have a shared language built from years of living inside the same story, finishing each other's context, laughing at references I didn't have. And his mother would watch them from across the table with an expression she never quite managed to hide. Something close to relief, like someone watching 2 puzzle pieces click back into place. I would sit there, contribute to the conversation when I could, smile at the right moments, and feel the particular exhaustion of someone performing normalcy at a volume that nobody around them requires. I never said any of this to Marcus. I tried once, carefully. Not as an accusation, but as an observation. I told him I sometimes felt like an outsider in his family's house. He looked genuinely confused. He said I was imagining things. He said his mother loved me. He said it in the tone of someone closing a door they don't realize they're closing. I didn't push. I told myself he was probably right. I went back to managing the household and paying the bills and being reliable and useful and invisible. That was my mistake. and I carried it quietly for longer than I should have. The evening Marcus told me about the anniversary dinner, I was at the kitchen counter going through a folder of insurance documents, the ordinary kind of task that fills the margins of a life like mine. He came in from the living room with his phone in his hand, and that particular ease in his posture that meant he had already decided something and was now simply informing me of it. "I invited Renee to my parents' anniversary dinner," he said. "Sophie should have both her parents there for something like that. It just makes sense." I set down the paper I was holding. Not dramatically, just set it down. "When did you decide that?" I asked. He shrugged. "A few days ago, maybe a week. I don't know, it came up." A few days, maybe a week. He wasn't sure. What he was sure about was that it had already been decided, already been communicated to Renee, already been accepted by his parents, who I could only assume had responded with exactly the kind of warm enthusiasm they reserved for things that felt like the family returning to its natural shape. "You could have mentioned it," I said. "I'm mentioning it now," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer, the complete absence of any recognition that something was wrong with it, landed somewhere inside me like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. "Okay," I said. He looked at me for a second, checking, I think, for signs of a conversation he would have to manage. I gave him nothing to manage. I picked up my paper and went back to the insurance documents. He seemed satisfied with that. He went back to the living room. I sat at that counter for a long time after he left, not reading, not thinking in any dramatic sense, just sitting with a feeling I couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like the moment you realize you've been reading a map upside down, and suddenly all the wrong turns start to make perfect sense. Nobody in that house had any idea that for the past 3 months, I had been quietly building a way out. And the most unsettling part was how easy it had been to do it right under everyone's noses. It hadn't started as a plan. That's the honest version. It had started as clarity. The kind that arrives not in a rush, but in layers. The way morning light fills a room so gradually you can't point to the exact moment it went from dark to bright. After the hallway moment with his mother on the phone, something in me had shifted from passive to observant. I started paying attention differently, not looking for problems, just stopping myself from looking away from them. And what I saw, once I allowed myself to see it clearly, was a system I had built almost entirely on my own. The internet, the utilities, the insurance policies, the joint accounts, the lease documentation, the health coverage, all of it flowed through me. My name, my logins, my spreadsheets, my reminders. Marcus contributed to our shared account each month and considered himself an equal partner in the finances. What he didn't realize was that contributing money and actually managing a financial life are two completely different things. One is a transaction, the other is a skill, and it was mine. I want to be clear about something because it matters for everything that comes later. I was not hiding anything. I was not being deceptive. Everything was documented. Everything was accurate. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. I had simply started, very quietly and very carefully, organizing what was mine separately from what was shared. Not moving anything, not closing anything, just drawing a line in my own mind first, then on paper, then in the structure of accounts and policies that most people never bother to understand until they suddenly and urgently need to. I consulted an attorney on a Tuesday afternoon. I told Marcus I had a work meeting running late. That was the only thing I was not fully honest about during this entire process, and I have thought about that since, and I think I would do it the same way again. Some conversations cannot happen before the decision is made. They only make sense after. The attorney was a calm, precise woman named Linda, who had clearly sat across from hundreds of people in exactly my situation. She asked me questions, and I answered them, and she nodded in a way that told me I had already done most of the work without knowing what I was doing it for. She said I was organized. She said that would matter. She said to keep doing what I was doing and come back when I was ready. I drove home that evening and made dinner and sat across from Marcus and his mother and listened to them talk about a project he was excited about. And I smiled in the right places, and nobody in that room had any idea that something had already, quietly begun. The anniversary dinner arrived the way these things do, with everyone else's energy already set and your own feelings expected to simply adapt to the room. Marcus's parents had been married for 32 years. The dinner was at their house, extended family, close friends, the kind of gathering that smells like good food and sounds like overlapping conversations, and feels, from the outside, warm and full of belonging. I had helped plan it. I had spent 2 weekends organizing details, coordinating with the caterer, ordering flowers, handling the things his mother kept describing as the practical side, in a tone that made practical sound like a lesser contribution than simply showing up. Renee arrived 40 minutes in, Sophie beside her, and the room did the thing it always did. It turned. His mother crossed the floor faster than I had seen her move all evening. His father stood from his chair. Even the cousins who barely knew her seemed to recalibrate toward her presence. Sophie ran to Marcus, and he swept her up, and they were instantly their own small world, the three of them, laughing at something Sophie was saying, Renee's hand resting briefly on Marcus's arm in the easy way of people who share a long history and have made their peace with it. I was standing near the window with a glass of water I had forgotten I was holding. A woman I didn't know well, a friend of his mother's, appeared beside me and said pleasantly, "It's so lovely that they all get along so well, isn't it?" It was not a question. She was already looking across the room when she said it, smiling at the scene, and I understood that in her version of this evening, I was a pleasant backdrop, nothing more. "Yes," I said. "Lovely." She drifted away. I looked at the window, and for a moment I could see my own reflection in the dark glass, faint and superimposed over the garden outside. And I thought about what Linda had said in her office that Tuesday afternoon. She had said, very simply, "The person who understands the structure is always the one with the clearest options." I set my glass down on the nearest surface and looked back at the room, at Marcus laughing, at his mother watching Renee with that expression she could never quite control, at Sophie, bright and oblivious and entirely deserving of a world where the adults around her handled things with dignity. I made my decision standing at that window, not in anger, not in grief, in the same quiet, factual way I had always made the decisions that actually mattered in this marriage. And nobody in that room noticed, which, by then, surprised me not at all. The morning after the anniversary dinner, I woke up before Marcus, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the early quiet, and did something I had never allowed myself to do before. I wrote down every single thing I contributed to our life. Not as a list of complaints, as a document, clean, factual, Organized, the way I organized everything at work. Rent coverage, utilities, insurance premiums, the two separate times I had quietly covered gaps in his business expenses without ever framing it as a loan. Grocery runs, appointment scheduling, the birthday gifts sent to his family members that always had both our names on the card but only ever came from my memory and my effort. I filled 2 pages before my coffee went cold. Then I sat and looked at what I had written and felt something I can only describe as the specific sadness of finally seeing something clearly that you had been carefully not looking at for a long time. Not rage, not bitterness. More like the feeling you get when you find an old receipt for something you paid too much for and can't return. Marcus came down 20 minutes later, rumpled and easy, poured himself coffee, kissed the top of my head the way he always did, and asked if I wanted to grab breakfast somewhere. I said sure. I folded my 2 pages and put them in my bag. He never asked what I had been writing. It would not have occurred to him to ask. We went to breakfast. He talked about a client meeting he had that week. I listened and responded and was completely present in the conversation and completely somewhere else at the same time. That is a skill, I realized, that I had been developing for months without naming it. When we got home, I went upstairs, opened my laptop, and sent Linda a message. 3 words. I am ready. What followed was not dramatic in the way people imagine these things are. There was no single confrontation, no moment where everything came apart at once. It was 2 weeks of careful, deliberate work that looked from the outside exactly like my ordinary life. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner. I asked Marcus about his day and listened to his answers. I was present and warm and completely focused, the way a person is when they have finally decided something, and the decision itself has given them a strange kind of calm. Meanwhile, in the margins of that ordinary life, I was methodically doing what Linda had advised. I separated my direct deposit to an account that was mine alone. I contacted the insurance provider and began the process of splitting the joint policy. I gathered documentation, statements, records, the kind of paper trail that tells the true story of a financial life when the spoken version has become unreliable. I did not take anything that wasn't mine. That was important to me. Not for legal reasons, though it mattered legally too, but because this was never about taking. It was about clarity, about drawing a line between what I had built and what I had contributed to, and making sure that line was visible and clean and could not be disputed. Marcus noticed nothing. His mother noticed nothing. The house ran the way it always ran because I was still running it, right up until the point when I was ready to stop. That part mattered. I want to be honest about why. It would have been easier in some ways to simply pull back immediately, to let the cracks show, to make the point through disruption. But that was not who I was, and it was not how I wanted to do this. If I was going to leave, I was going to leave with my integrity intact and the record completely clear. The letter from my attorney arrived at Marcus's office, not at the house. That was deliberate too. I had thought carefully about where he should be when he found out. Not in his mother's kitchen. Not in a space where the first voice he heard after reading it would be hers. He deserved to receive the information as an adult, in a place where he would have to sit with it quietly for at least a little while before anyone else could shape his reaction. His assistant called him in from a meeting, apparently. I learned this later. She handed him the envelope, he looked at the return address, and something in his face changed before he even opened it. He told the client he needed 20 minutes and went to his office and closed the door. He sat there for an hour. His first call was not to his mother. It was to me. I was in a meeting when my phone lit up on the table beside my notebook. I saw his name on the screen, and I felt my chest tighten in the way it still did, the way it probably always would, because leaving someone you genuinely loved was not the same as not loving them anymore. I let it ring. I turned my phone face down and went back to the meeting. When I checked it afterward, there were 4 missed calls and 1 message. It said simply, "Claire, please." I read it twice. Then I put my phone in my bag and walked to my car and sat in the parking garage in the quiet and the gray concrete stillness, and allowed myself, for exactly 5 minutes, to feel the full weight of what I was doing. Then I started the engine and drove to my new apartment to finish what I had already begun. Marcus showed up at my new apartment on a Wednesday evening without warning, and when I opened the door and saw his face, I understood immediately that his mother had gotten to him first. There was a particular tightness around his jaw that I recognized. It was the expression he wore when he had already rehearsed a conversation, when someone had helped him prepare what to say, and he was now delivering it with slightly more confidence than the situation actually gave him. His mother had a gift for that. She could frame any story in a way that made her version feel like the only logical one, and Marcus had been listening to her version of things his entire life. He said he wanted to talk. I stepped back and let him in. The apartment was small and quiet, and smelled like the candle I had bought for myself the first week I moved in. Something warm and clean that I had chosen entirely because I liked it and for no other reason. Marcus looked around the space the way people do when they are trying to understand something through objects, taking in the bookshelf I had organized, the plant by the window I was keeping alive, the coffee mug on the counter with my name on it that a colleague had given me as a moving-in gift. Small things, all mine. He sat down on the couch, and I sat across from him in the chair, and we looked at each other for a moment in the strange silence of 2 people who used to share everything and now shared nothing but history. "My mom thinks you're doing this to punish me," he said. "I know she does," I replied. "Is she wrong?" I looked at him steadily. "Yes." He exhaled, rubbed a hand across his face. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than 1 bad week, and part of me felt that, recognized it, wanted to reach toward it the way you reach toward something familiar, even when you know better. "I've been going through everything," he said. "The accounts, the bills, everything you managed. I called the utility provider to update the billing, and they told me the account was already transferred. I called the internet company. Same thing. I tried to check the joint insurance policy and realized I didn't even know the login because I had never needed to know it." He said all of this without accusation, just with the slow, heavy recognition of someone counting the steps of a staircase they had been climbing for years without ever looking down. "You built all of it," he said. "Yes," I said, "and I just assumed it existed." "Yes," I said again. That one landed differently. I could see it in the way his shoulders shifted, the way he looked away toward the window where the evening light was coming in gray and soft. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something. Ordinary sounds, the world continuing at its usual pace, while something inside that small apartment shifted permanently. "I didn't see you," he said quietly, not as an excuse, as a confession. I felt the truth of that settle in my chest, not painfully, not anymore, but with the dull finality of something that had already been true for a long time and was only now being named out loud. I know, I said. That's why I left. He didn't argue. That was the thing I had not expected, even then. No pushback, no redirect toward his mother's framing, no attempt to renegotiate the facts into something more comfortable. Just a man sitting in a chair in my small apartment, finally still enough to hear something he had spent years being too busy or too comfortable to notice. We talked for another hour. Not about the legal process. That was for the attorneys, and it was already moving forward cleanly. We talked about the actual thing, the years of it, the small dismissals that had accumulated like sediment until the riverbed changed shape entirely. He talked, I listened. I talked, he listened. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and it was happening too late to change anything, which is perhaps the most human kind of conversation there is. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not guilt, exactly. Something quieter. Something that looked like the beginning of understanding. Were you happy? He asked. At any point, were you actually happy? I thought about that honestly, the way the question deserved. In the beginning, I said, yes, genuinely. He nodded once, accepting that, and then he left. I closed the door and stood in my quiet apartment and listened to his footsteps go down the hallway, and then nothing. Just the candle and the plant and the coffee mug and the life I was building, one deliberate choice at a time. The legal process concluded on a morning that felt entirely ordinary, which is exactly how it should have felt. A small office, 2 attorneys, a table, documents that had been reviewed and agreed upon and were now simply waiting for signatures. Marcus and I sat across from each other and signed what needed to be signed, and that was that. 4 years of a shared life reduced to paperwork, which sounds bleak until you understand that the paperwork was never the point. The point was what came after it. I drove from that office to my apartment, changed my clothes, and went to work. My colleague Dana was in the kitchen when I arrived, and she looked at me for a moment with the quiet attentiveness of someone who had watched this whole process from a careful distance. She didn't ask how I was. She just handed me a coffee and said, "You look like yourself today." I thought about that for the rest of the morning because she was right, and because it had been a long time since that was true. The weeks that followed were quiet in the best possible way. Not empty, quiet. There is a difference that is hard to explain until you have lived on both sides of it. I came home to a space that responded only to my choices. I cooked what I wanted to eat. I spent my evenings the way I wanted to spend them. I managed my finances with the same care I had always applied, except now every decision led somewhere I had actually chosen. Marcus and I exchanged a few messages in the months after, practical things mostly, a forwarded piece of mail, a shared subscription that needed canceling, the ordinary loose ends of a life being untangled. His messages were brief and respectful. Mine were the same. Whatever needed to be said between us had been said in my small apartment on that Wednesday evening, and we both seemed to understand that without needing to discuss it. His mother sent me an email once. It surprised me enough that I read it 3 times before I believed it was real. It was short, not an apology exactly, but something in that direction. She said she had been thinking. She said she had perhaps not made things easy. She said she hoped I was well. I wrote back 2 sentences, thanked her, wished her the same. That was the end of it, and it was enough. Renee I never spoke to again directly. and I felt no need to. She had always been exactly what she was, Sophie's mother. A woman navigating her own complicated situation. No villain in my story, despite the role that had been unconsciously assigned to her. The real story had never been about her. It had been about what I had been willing to accept, and for how long, and what happened the moment I stopped. That is the thing I think about most now, sitting in the apartment that feels more like home every single month. Not the ending, the moment I stopped. There was no single dramatic turning point. There was no explosion, no confrontation, no grand gesture. There was just a woman standing at a window at a family party, seeing her own reflection superimposed over a garden, and making a decision so quiet that nobody in the room even noticed it happen. The most important decisions rarely announce themselves. They arrive in stillness, in clarity, in the moment you finally stop arguing with what you already know. I had spent years being the foundation of something that nobody thought to look down at. And the moment I stepped off that foundation, the structure did not collapse dramatically. It just became someone else's problem to figure out. Which, it turns out, is its own kind of answer. You cannot pour yourself into something indefinitely and call it love if the person on the other side has never once stopped to ask what it costs you. That is not partnership. That is just a habit that benefits one person more than the other, dressed up in the language of family and practicality and the way things have always been. I know my worth now, not because someone finally told me, because I stopped waiting for someone to tell me and decided to demonstrate it to myself instead. And here is the question I want to leave you with, because I think about this more than anything else. If you woke up tomorrow and quietly stopped doing every single thing you do for the people around you, how long would it take them to notice? Not the big visible things, the invisible ones. The things you do because nobody else does them, because you are reliable, because you are the kind of person who simply handles it. How long? And what does your answer tell you about where you actually stand? Think about that honestly. Write your answer in the comments because I genuinely want to know. And I think you might surprise yourself. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt familiar in a way you are still sitting with, please leave a like and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you know. New stories are coming, and you do not want to miss them.